This is a Hot Wheels Classic 31 Ford Woody produced in 1969 by Mattel. All of these 1969 Ford models were produced in the US. This model and the 32 Ford Vicky made the same year are notable as they are the only models that came with either a matte black or a glossy textured black roof. This one appears to be the flat black roof, but I'll show you a glossy black one later. Troy Grant sent me this model to be restored. It was his father's childhood toy. Like most cars of this vintage, it suffers from a lot of oxidation and plating bubbles. Beyond that though, it's in really good shape. The 31 Ford Woody happens to be one of the few carded vintage Redlines that I own. This is actually a carded vintage error. If you look closely, you can see that the interior plastic was not properly installed when the car was put together. These two cars are actually painted the same lime color, but over time, Troy's car has seemed to shift more toward the green tone. Anyway, let's take it apart. Like a lot of models, Mattel used the engine as a holding fixture between the body and the base. This car is still employing the bent axle suspension made popular by the original 16 Hot Wheels cars the year before. However, they are now crimped into place and are non-replaceable. I despise this version of the suspension as the crimped parts tend to come loose and spin in place. This allows a lot of play in the suspension. If you can take the car apart, you can glue the wire back in place, fixing the issues. If you can't take the car apart, then you have to live with floppy wheels. All the internal parts are in good order, so I'll go ahead and remove the paint. With the paint removed, you can get a good idea of how much oxidation the car actually has. I was surprised the roof was in that bad a shape given it had an extra layer of black paint over the Spectra flame. You can also see on this car where the plating has bubbled. This probably happened when the car was plated and not due to age. The next step will be to remove as much of the oxidation as possible via the electropolishing setup. This will do a good portion of the hard work so that I don't have to spend so much time sanding. Sanding is typically the longest portion of the restoration. Here I am trying to remove some of the plating bubbles mentioned before. This car has a lot of details, so sanding is mostly limited to using steel wool and sanding needles, at least on the sides. Here you can see how it looked after I was done. There's still a lot of discoloration, but that will be fixed in the next step, zinc electroplating. I've been playing around a lot with my zinc electroplating setup. I'll leave a link to the original video, but right now I run the car for about 30 minutes at about a volt and around 200 milliamps. I then pull the car out and go over it with some 4/0 steel wool. I then plate it for another 30 minutes at the same settings, pull it out, go over it with steel wool. Last, I then put it in for an hour at about half a volt and 75 milliamps. In between each plating session, I rewash the car in soapy water and then in degreaser. It ends up being a lot more work, but the end result is much better. After the last plating session, the car will have a hazy gray look to it. This is removed with some 4/0 steel wool, which will bring out the shine of the zinc plating. You can see after the entire car has been polished with the steel wool how nice and bright the metal looks compared to before. I could go over this with a polishing wheel and get a mirror finish, but really this is how the cars would have looked originally, and I want to go for a true restoration on this car. Since I have all these baths up and running, I'll go ahead and take a look at the base. Before I mess with the metal, I will first remove the wheels by cutting them off. You can see that there is a substantial amount of oxidation on the base, so I'll give it some time in the electropolishing setup to remove all that oxidation. As before, there's a lot of discoloration and pitting, so to get a uniform look to the metal, I'll also zinc plate it and go over everything with steel wool. This time I'll only plate it for about 30 minutes at 200 milliamps, good enough for the base. Last, I'll repeat all these steps for the engine, and then clear coat both the base and the engine with Tester's matte clear coat. This will protect the zinc metal along with the Zamac underneath. With any luck, all these parts will make it another 50 years. With the base cleaned up, I can go ahead and add on the repo wheels, and then using an axle bending tool, I can get the axles straightened out so that the car sits correctly. One big note here is to be very careful not to break the axles loose of the base, or you'll have to deal with the floppy wheels I mentioned earlier. Alright, the car is finally ready for paint. As I said before, I'll be going with lime for the Spectra flame, and then using a special black vinyl paint for all the vinyl features. All the paints and the axle tool can be purchased from the redlineshop.com, and I'll leave links below. I think I've mentioned before that Spectra flame is a very easy paint to apply. It comes airbrush ready. All you need to do is add some hardener to it before spraying it on. The hardener will make the paint much more durable than if it wasn't used. Once the Spectra Flame paint is cured, I can then mask off the roof and paint on the black vinyl paint. The masking is a bit tricky here, as it's only a small amount of the roof border that needs to be covered, and the border width needs to be the same on all sides. The black vinyl paint sprays on just as easy as the Spectra Flame and requires about 2 coats to get full coverage. The paint needs to dry for about a day before you touch it, or else I find it can flake off. After a day though, it really firms up and flaking off is no longer an issue. Just like the roof, I'll repeat the same steps and paint in the grille. So now it's a couple of days later and everything is cured, so I can put the car back together. Normally I'd give the before and after here, but first I want to put it next to the Near Mint on Card Original, since that's what I'm going for. I personally feel that it's a pretty close match, but you can let me know if you think differently below. And of course I'll do the normal before and after comparison. So I'm very pleased with the outcome of this Ford Woody. There were no major issues or surprises with this casting. Hopefully Troy will also like it. He had contacted me several years ago about doing this restoration. Life got in the way for both of us, and we forgot about it until my last video. In a way, I'm very glad I waited. When he first contacted me about it, I was rather intimidated by this car. There are lots of details and other pitfalls in a car like this. But by waiting, I have many more tools available to me, along with far more experience than I had years ago. As such, the car is no longer intimidating to me, and I feel I was able to give him a restored car I can feel proud of. I tell you all this as a way to push you in whatever art or hobby you're involved in. The more practice, the better you get. I know it's a ridiculous platitude, but true all the same. So, as always, let me know your thoughts below, and thanks for watching.